former Mayor of Port Moody, Mike Clay. Welcome and thank you for being here for a discussion on provincial politics, the provincial election, and most specifically, housing policy.
Thanks for having me.
Over the last 12 months, there's been some of the boldest regulatory announcements in British Columbia housing that I've seen in my career and likely in the history of the province. What do you think about the provincial housing policies that have been announced over the last 12 to 18 months?
A lot of it's confusing to me. It depends on what they're trying to accomplish. People talk about housing affordability and then they do things that may change supply. They may get things to the market faster, but are they going to make them more affordable? And how is that going to happen? You know, when they've done things to sort of force increased density on municipalities, I understand why they're doing it, because the speed of change in municipalities has been so slow, dreadfully slow for a lot of people. And when you're growing and the cities aren't accepting that, at some point somebody needs to make the decision, and the cities weren't making them. Sometimes it feels like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Are they changing the system because they had people not capable of working the system, or was it a bad system? Time will tell on some of them, and I think some of them are going to have to be tweaked to actually come up with the results they want.
A provincial election coming up in less than 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Who are you voting for in Port Moody?
This is the worst choice, I think, that I remember. I voted the spectrum, both provincially and federally, when I voted, for different parties. And do a shout out for James Filippelli with the my political party of BC, who I supported, and particularly in the time when he ran, it was a good time. I really believe not necessarily in minority governments, but to have some independent voices there. And I think no matter who wins the election, to have effective people on every side, because nobody's right. They're all partly right. I'm not happy with what the province has done. I've seen the provincial government do a lot of knee-jerk stuff in the last couple of years, which bothers me because it's probably not long-term good planning. But there's some stuff coming from all the parties where I'm like, oh, that's a terrible idea. I think we're way off course right now as a province, and I don't know who's going to fix that. I get when Kevin Falcon threw the towel in, I was like, oh, maybe this is the time. When Andrew Weaver came storming back with the Green Party, and they were he was the green guy in a suit, and his campaign to me was we can be good business people and we can be green. We can have a green economy. We don't have to have one or the other. And I feel like the Green Party's gone back to, shut down industry, shut down everything. So I'm a Green Party member. I'm struggling with where they go when they get more radical on anti-government things. I don't understand. I can't vote for the NDP locally. I have some friends in the NDP party, but our MLA is so God knows where on. I live in an apartment in a high density development, but I don't want anybody else to. And I'm not going to allow future development because Port Moody shouldn't grow and it should stay. I don't know. I guess he wants to go back to when my grandpa was here in the 30s and open up some mills. I don't know. And I'm known to be, a little bit right lean. I think I'm center right. I'm fiscally conservative and I'm socially liberal. I think I want our seniors and our kids to be looked after, but I want a government that cares about spending and the economy and, leaving a future behind and, and spending money on taking care of people. So I don't see that from any of them, but I think the only choice that I have right now is probably leaning conservative, because I know what the NDP is doing, and I know I agree with some of it and I don't agree with some of it. I think that the conservative general messaging aligns with me. I would have loved to have seen any one of them acknowledge that our healthcare system is in shambles, and it should be the number one concern for British Columbians that are living here right now. I know the housing crisis is a big deal, but for those of us that tomorrow might need to go to a hospital, we need to fix that system up. And I think it'll take some bold moves and some. I haven't seen the NDP in the 7 years. I haven't seen them do anything to fix healthcare. So I know they had COVID. I know that was difficult, but then I haven't seen a lot of action in the last couple of years to get it back on track. So I don't know. I don't know. I'm going to go vote. I'm going to stand there and look at the ballot, and I don't know who I'm going to vote for in the moment, but I'm leaning on the conservative side because, again, I think that aligns best with my way of thinking policy-wise. I worry about some of the antics of a few of their candidates, not our candidate. I think she's fine. But again, I think I'd be less worried about any of it if governments just, hired professionals to do the operating and the managing and worked at a policy level. And because I think all the parties have, they have a difference in policy, but none of them are as bad as they sometimes end up being when they're executed, because they get ideology attached to policy, and then they try to steer the direction of the bureaucracy, which is good at doing their jobs, but they're not good at being politicians. So let's hope that I would hope that we get a mix. I kind of, for a while there, I was hoping that the BC United people that got bumped when the party dissolved, that maybe 11 or 12 of them would run independently and that they would carry the balance of power, because the ones that I think were left there that I know are real middle right. They're very, very much in the center. I know them personally. They're good people. They're conscientious. They have families. They have grandparents. They care about the province. And I would have loved to have seen them just being able to throw their voice in and say, hey, hang on, you were okay up to here? Because traditionally, when the NDP was down to 2 seats and the Liberals had whatever it was, 78 or whatever at the time, Parliament with a majority government, they can do what they want. They're not going to be swayed. So maybe a minority situation, but I saw the Green leader first enough saying that they'll hold the balance of power. It's like they're projected to win maybe 1 seat, so that's not going to be the balance of power. So we'll see how it goes. Maybe some of those independents that are running will have a say, and I love independents. I think if some of these countries where they have a parliament made up of independents, I know that it's mayhem at times, but I think it forces everybody to come back towards the middle, because I think the left and the right here now are both moving to their respective corners a little too much. We'll see. I don't think we're doomed no matter who gets elected. I like some of what I've seen from some new candidates on all party sides. Maybe they'll bring some fresh ideas. So we're going to get a bunch of new MLAs no matter what happens. So maybe that'll be good, and maybe that'll. I don't have a lot of hope that the next 4 years are going to be much better, because these problems are too big to sort out short term. But let's hope there's some movement, some steps.
I'll reserve comment on education or healthcare because I do not have the expertise to understand either of the policies and which would be the best pathway forward. I'm a traditional conservative. I believe in the free market and providing opportunities for young entrepreneurs like myself to be creative in the marketplace. This is the first time I've really been impressed with the NDP. And even if we don't agree with the approach that they took, it was really refreshing to see a government take a stance and back themselves 100%. And that's what I saw EB and Calon do in the housing. They wanted to tackle the issue and they wanted to make a big impact, and they did. Is it perfect? No. Is there updates that are going to need to happen? Yes. So I give them a lot of respect for taking those bold moves. Ultimately, I'm going to be voting BC Conservative. I believe in the positions that they're taking to allow for the free market to create creative solutions, to incentivize cities to build more housing and put the infrastructure behind them, to open up natural gas as a heating source, to trust the industry professionals like engineers and architects and not have as much back and forth with city staffs, so that building permits can be issued in 3 months, development permits and rezonings within 6 months. So ultimately that has moved me into the cautiously optimistic that the Conservatives will be able to carry on what the NDP have done, improve it and enhance it. And locally here, I thought Carrie Van Aswagen was a really good candidate from the private sector who has administered a small business, performing jobs for the local governments and the BC government, understanding the red tape and the processes that a small business has to go through to work in our local economy. And I think she's going to do a great job for Port Moody and Burke Whitlam.
Yeah, housing wise, I think that if you want to give props, they're trying things which may take courage. So we'll see how some of this stuff works out. I think some of it has been miscalculated. I think going to the processes rather than saying we're going to get rid of public hearings or whatever. I know it probably is inevitable, but I think they could have stepped towards that by saying we're going to have a different process to replace that. But my big thing to me is, until the government says that they're going to be in the market, they're only going to be able to have so much impact. If they could put their money where their mouth is and say, this is such good policy, we're going to back it. We're going to fund it. We're going to own the land that those projects sit on. And then take everything that I've heard John Rustad say, except keep the land. Let the private sector build and even manage and develop, but keep the land ownership underneath those buildings. We do airspace parcels now. There's a lot of ways to do that.
The First Nations are great examples.
And they can keep the ownership of the land. Everything is fraught with issues. I think some of the housing thing, I think you're going to find they've made mistakes and they're going to tweak them. And other stuff they're going to take further. And other stuff, before we blink, we're just going to forget that it was ever the old way, because it is the right thing. And it's a good first step, if not the last step. So I think right now, provincially, whoever wins this election isn't going to get away from housing. They're going to continue with the same sort of policy decisions. How fast and heavy-handed they're willing to be about it. It is encouraging to hear Mr. Rustat saying certain things that, this is going to happen on this timeline and with these dollars. That's commitment that if he gets elected, I'm sure he'll be held to. Whereas NDP are making more general terms about, they have policy now that they can point to, but they're not making as specific terms as the Conservatives about moving forward. So yeah, housing is going to have big days ahead, no matter what. I don't think any of us know singularly what the answer is.
So let's clarify some of the major announcements, and then we'll pick one or two of them to hone in on. So in December of 2023, there were three bills that were introduced. The first was to require condo density around 104 SkyTrain stations, West Coast Express stops, and major bus loops, going from 800 meters, 8 stories, up to within 200 meters, 20 stories. That's the TOA designations. Secondly, there was the small scale multi unit housing, which was an announcement across the province for every single family and duplex property to allow for between 4 and 6 townhouse units. Thirdly, was a reformed way for cities to charge bonus density fees and amenity cost contributions and restructure how fees were being charged by cities. So starting at the top, TOAs, what were your thoughts on the mandated densities around SkyTrain stations, West Coast Express, and major bus loops?
Well, I think that has to exist, right? You're investing billions of taxpayer dollars, provincial taxpayer dollars, into transit and transportation solutions. That if the cities, and we're we're in one, you do a whatever $2 billion SkyTrain expansion, you can't do that investment and think that you're going to live in small town Pitt Meadows when somebody's just put a $2 billion transit into your neighborhood. So I think, you plan it well, work with what you have, and then you accept that's the route forward. The policy decision on that by the provincial government is probably a good base. It's a good indicator. Cities didn't seem to be willing to step up. And I think part of it might go to your third part. Cities were playing the numbers game where the way they could get money from developers is to give uplifts in zoning and overarching on the zoning of what was allowed. So if we let you build a 30-story tower, what are you going to give us? The bad part of that might be what they did in the third part. If you take the ability for cities to get revenues associated with that bonus density or density increases, whether it's around transit or not, isn't the important part now. It's what have you done to the city? Can they afford to build the streets and the sidewalks and the roads and the pipes, the sewers? And that seems to be where some of the municipalities are pushing back on it, is you've taken away the power for us to fund what we need in infrastructure for all those people.
This is an interesting point because the way that I understood the policies, and let's take the ACCs as an example, was the main purpose of this new ACC was that the fee negotiation between city and developer was undefined. And because you have a 2 to 3 year rezoning process, the developer would not know what the fee for the density would be until well after land acquisition. So the purpose of the ACCs was to have a defined bonus density payment based on a per square foot of density so that there was more clarity within the marketplace. And the cities had the flexibility to have that ACC be whatever they wanted it to be. So it did have to be reasonable. And the province said that if it was too high and it started to deter development, that the province would step in. Why are the cities complaining about this? Why don't they just increase the fees to what they need to provide the services that they are seeking?
On the more skeptical side of it, cities seem to spend every penny you give them and they want more. And what do they spend it on? Are they spending it on necessities of running a city, or are they spending it on things that are outside of their mandate and things that they just shouldn't be even participating in. There's a lot of people that will say, the roads and the sidewalks and the sewers, and get out of all that other stuff. Parks and libraries are kind of where some people teeter. And then you get a lot of people who go right off the edge when you start talking about museums and art galleries and stuff. They're like, that's not a municipal mandate. So I think that's where you get a difference of opinion. People say all that stuff builds the culture of the community, which is the city I've chosen to live in. I think if they had cleaned up DCCs, where development cost charges have such prescriptive things that they're allowed to fund. So somebody says, well, we're going to build a high rise there, and the DCCs you're allowed to include, roads and some transportation infrastructure, if you can show that it's immediately affecting by that development. So if you wanted to build an overpass down the street, somebody's going to critique you and say, well, no, that's nothing to do with this development. But all of those little developments add up to 75,000 cars on the road going through the Tri-Cities every day. Where did they come from? They came, 15 here, 30 there, 40 there. And the DCCs didn't account for that. On the flip side, we get CACs, which are voluntary amenity contributions that cities are negotiating. And then what did they start doing with the money? A lot of the people will tell you that the money was wasted, or it was poorly spent, or it wasn't long-term thinking driven. It was very short-term, very immediate thinking. And so from that point, I understand what you're saying about, a formulaic ACC where you're saying this is what it is. But I think there's huge conversations and different for other cities about what that formula should look like. And I think that's, the part where I see danger in it is when you move that conversation to some bureaucrats in Victoria isn't the same as the city council in Chetwynd or Dawson Creek, saying, what do we need in our community? And how different is that than what Port Moody or Burnaby need? So I think that it's fraught with opportunities for the exact same things to start to happen. You're going to have somebody out there who's, if you've got one formula, they're making a profit off of it because they don't do any of those things. And on the other hand, you've got people who are like, this isn't even covering our costs. My preference for all this would have been that cities were just doing a better job, a more realistic job of staying in their lane, doing what their mandate is, so that at least then if what you're saying is true, everybody would be pointing back at the province saying, hey, what happened to you? Where's your role in this? So it's, too multifaceted, I think, to have a simple solution. And I think that's what worries me is some of the solutions offered from the province have been simple in nature. So we'll see. And a lot of them aren't going to work, I'm sure. And a lot of them need to be tweaked.
What are your thoughts on the BC Conservatives' commitment for a $1 billion infrastructure fund to support cities?
So my number one thing about any market, you can't just dictate to a market how they're going to behave. If you're in it, you can influence, and if you're not, go home. Like, you have no business until the province retains some form of ownership in the housing market. They can't control how it works. Like, everybody knows, it doesn't matter what housing build costs are. It's a market. So people will, if it costs me $200,000 to build a condo in Yaletown, I'm still going to sell it for 1.8 million because that's the market. If the province wants to come along and own the land, I think own the land, let the private sector develop the land and even run a rental, but keep ownership of that land so that in perpetuity they're in the market. Nobody can say to them, well, the land costs were too high. They can just say, no, it's our land. It kind of goes back to those 1970s co-ops where the land was separated from the structures. So now a lot of those are like end of life, but the land is still owned by a third party and they can redevelop those and move them forward again as a rental or as a co-op model, which once you sell the land to private ownership, if I'm the private owner, you're not going to get me to be a social service agency and provide affordable housing. So how do we do that? You stay in the market. And the feds and the province have the opportunity, especially with crown land and stuff, to stay in the market. Trade some land on Burke Mountain to a developer if they buy or give some land that they have somewhere that it's more needed. You don't want to push people that are less wealthy and less able to travel around with cars and everything else out into the edges of the suburbs. So maybe you need to make a deal to say, hey, people want to build $2 million homes up on Westwood Plateau. Let them, but we want something back where we need it for those other uses. Any government that wants to, yell and scream and say stuff when they're not in the market can say whatever they want. It's going to be temporary at best. And if they don't have any ownership, then what happens? End of life. It's just a market play now. And we're not around at that point, but whoever is in the market then is going to say, oh, we need affordable housing. And it's all just going to keep going around and around. So they're not, in my mind, they're not doing anything to change that. Giving people that $1 billion into a housing fund, that money will be gone in a heartbeat because everybody can spend money. But what's it going to accomplish? Temporary relief in a market. And we've gotten away for a long time, governments not having to talk about affordable housing. I went through all of my terms of Port Moody until the very end when we built the first rental housing that's been built in the Tri-Cities in 3 decades. So no previous people to me or previous, when the BC Liberals were in, before the NDP came in, it was just starting to become, people were like, hey, housing affordability is becoming an issue. But they never had to sit around day after day and month after month and say, what are we going to do about affordable housing? Now it's gone from not talked about to top of the stack. So the gut reaction is to start rearranging those deck chairs and taking money from this pot and moving it over there. And that's not, it needs to be looked at long term. And I think long term, the province needs to be in the market. Because it also, to me, when any government says, well, you shouldn't be allowed to charge that for rent, it's like, well, then you run it and you tell me what you could run it for. Because going after landlords that are, their landlords aren't printing money around here. Some of them are private landlords. So if you had to buy a condo, somebody says, oh, they're renting that for $4,000. It's like, yeah, that covers half their mortgage. The reason you don't own it is because you can't afford to buy it. So somebody has bought it with their money and now they're renting it to try to get some of their money back. And you're belittling that as them being terrible landlords and gougers. And that's not fair either. You can't put all that back on private citizens. And for 40 years in BC, we had private citizens providing affordable housing. And it wasn't until interest rates came down and prices went up that all of a sudden there was a housing crisis. So I don't know, push interest rates back up, lower the housing prices. I don't know what would do it, but the government has to be in it because you can't just sit on the edges and tell people you need to behave like this, like with the Airbnbs and all that stuff, because then people are just going to say, fine, I'll take the money somewhere else and they'll find a spot.
Believe in the government having a safety net and taking care of people who either can't work or down on their luck, temporarily helping lift people up from the bottom. The goal of affordable housing, who should the government be responsible for providing affordable housing to? Is it all income earners? Is it income earners up to the top 60%? How far should this affordable housing promise go? And how many people should we be looking to provide these subsidized rents for?
That's the biggest question in the world. So it all trickles up and it all trickles down. I think that's why you need to look at the whole continuum. We need, $1 million homes at the Street of Dreams in Coquitlam on Westwood Plateau. We need the British properties. We need Yaletown. We need Richmond. We need Surrey. That gives you the continuum. And I think you have to be really careful in places like Port Moody where you understand we're in a metropolis of 3.5 million people in Metro Vancouver. We can't think like a little island of 33,000 people and only worry about ourselves because all of those other 3.4 million people are very mobile. They don't need to stay in Port Moody. They'll go to Coquitlam, they'll go to Delta, they'll go to New West. And I think we saw that for years. New Westminster built a huge community of transit users because they had rentals and they had more affordability there, and people could get around the region from New West. Metrotown grew up by being what do you call it, the hub of all the spokes. And they had a continuum of housing there that went from, I'm going to say for them in the Metrotown area, probably from low to high middle. But they also, they built the high rises and stuff. And they said, well, this isn't going to be a single family home neighborhood. In those developments, you can say we're going to have really nice expensive places. And maybe you find a way that they can help fund the subsidized or more affordable housing for people who can't afford it. And there's no reason that you can't do the continuum. Transit gives the ability for people with less financial ability to maybe live in a better home because they don't have to spend all their money on cars and insurance and everything to get around. I think a lot of that stuff will naturally level itself just by saying New Westminster, Burnaby, Coquitlam, Port Moody, we're in the inner circle and people don't need to spend as much of their income traveling. When everybody moved to Langley years ago, it was way more affordable, but they had no transit. So then they start saying, I don't want bridge tolling. I don't want this. I want transit out here. It's like, yeah, but that becomes very artificial now because now you're asking everybody to pay $8 billion to bring you a SkyTrain line while you live on a property that you paid a third of what I paid for in Port Moody because I chose to stay closer to where I work and live and play. You're transiting every day in your car because you chose to live somewhere cheaper, but your overall costs aren't that much cheaper. So how do you level that? You have to be looking at the whole picture. And that's where, if the province is active in the markets, if everybody's active in saying, why do we all go into Vancouver every day? I think COVID has woken us up to the fact we don't all have to go into Vancouver every day. So I think if you plan it well, you can level that off where the people who want to live in the British properties and Tsawwassen, on the waterfront, they don't need subsidies, and they're not going to be subsidized that way because they're outside of the model. Everybody that's in the urban town centers and the transit hubs are going to naturally be protected because it was well planned and well thought out. And the pricing is going to reflect, how well it's planned and how well it's managed. And for God's sake, stop looking at 21 municipalities all doing their own. You need some overarching principles where you just say it's not realistic for every little community in Metro Vancouver to be trying to do everything.
This is where I see challenges with the pursuit of affordability within all levels of government and as a society in Vancouver. We're 3 million people, and you look at cities like Toronto, New York, larger cities in California, and then even to the even mega cities in Asia, where Shanghai you have 20 million people. And Vancouver is one of the most beautiful cities in the world. If we built 10 million homes, there will be more than 10 million people across the planet that will want to be here. And until you shut the borders and stop immigration or even slow down migration, people moving from Edmonton, Toronto into the Vancouver marketplace, we can continually build, and there'll be very little effect that we can have on market pricing. How do we solve this pursuit of affordability if we have essentially unlimited demand?
Yeah, I think that it's the global economy, and the world is a small place. People are very portable now. They can move to the other side of the planet if that's what they choose to do, and do the same type of work. And so if you've got skills, if you're in the movie industry or you're a tech person, you can take that anywhere on the globe, and you can find somewhere to work. I think Canada as a country is always challenging because we've got 35 million people that all live on a 200-kilometer wide corridor. If they could find ways in Canada to attract immigration or migration to different places than the big four, get Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, Calgary now, I guess, if you could do something to spread out the population, if you have sensible immigration policies, and if you have sensible, ways of balancing the population out, it's like pouring, water into cups. At some point, they will level themselves if they're properly arranged. Vancouver has a very temperate climate. It's very attractive for people to come, and it's connected well to the global economy. So there is a lot of opportunities here, but there's a lot of drawbacks to being in Canada versus other places. We have a heavy tax regime and stuff in this country. So, and that's the trouble. Then everybody says, well, we have to help people with less income. So we're going to lower their taxes, or we're going to raise the taxes on the wealthy. And now the constant conversation in this country seems to be we're going to raise taxes on the wealthy. We're going to go after these billionaires. The fact of the matter is billionaires pay an awful lot of tax. They're subsidizing an awful lot of what all of us do. So you start scaring them out of the country, you're setting up for like a huge collapse at some point, where you took what, we wanted to reduce that a little bit, but if you overreact, you collapse the whole economy or an area or a region, and all of a sudden you're walking down empty streets with buildings that have, tumbleweeds in them. So I'm not a global economist. I don't know what you do about it, but I think that, a lot of that stuff can be looked at on what are you doing in your neighborhoods, and how is that indicative of what's going on in the bigger picture. I think one thing we've learned as the world has gotten smaller is we're all very similar. Shortages and housing crisis, a lot of people jump up right away and they say it's everywhere. So housing prices in Vancouver, they don't seem to be doing that. Calgary seems to have really affordable housing right now compared to Vancouver, even though it's been a big financial growth and everything there over the years. And I don't know why. We have New York style housing prices, but we don't have a New York style economy here. We're not the global headquarters for multinational corporations. I never want to tell people you can't come here. I don't think that's, I guess because I grew up in a time where everybody was coming here.
So one of the challenges of affordable housing, and we made one of the biggest commitments with dedicating 30% of our building as below market rentals. And we're going to open up applications to be in Port Moody significantly below market. How many applications are we going to get? And then how are we going to select the 26
You're going to get 100
lucky,
times more than you have. Yeah.
lucky homeowners who are going to receive a $40,000 to $50,000 a year subsidy on their rent? And do we say no, if you apply from Toronto, that automatically excludes you? Do we say no if you apply from Kelowna, that automatically excludes you? New West, Burnaby, you have to be in Vancouver. Like, how do we fairly
Yeah.
distribute the below market housing?
Yeah, I don't. I again, when people are so afraid of like means testing or saying, that person's poor or that person makes more money than that person, it's difficult. Yeah, I think that's why they came up with this number that affordability is 30% of your income, right? Because that's not putting a number on it; it's just putting a percentage on it. So again, if you're one of these multimillionaires, 30% of your income would buy you an awful lot of housing. But for most of us, there's nothing in Vancouver we can buy for that. I'm of a generation where I'm lucky that I had property that I purchased or inherited at a very young age at a very small dollar value that's worth, I don't know, more than 10 times more now than it was 25 years ago. Everybody now in this city, in Vancouver, say proper, probably would qualify for some type of housing subsidy because none of us could afford just that property on what we have. You're going to get an awful lot more applications than you have units for. I don't want to be you when it comes to that. It's very hard. I've got young people in my life that I know are never going to own. They've given up. So what do? They're going to rent, and you want their rent to be affordable for them. If somebody owns that unit and it's they had to buy it, they can't rent it for 2 bedrooms for $1,200 a month because their mortgage costs on that, without their own cash injection, it's $7,000, $6,000 a month. Who's got that? What 19-year-old has that to pay for rent? My heart bleeds for everyone. I think it's easier to say to somebody who makes 400 grand a year that they're not going to get a subsidy, but it's really difficult for the young people.
That's where we have a challenge with affordable housing requirements within housing, because it creates a small number of winners, and we have a close friend who won a rent to own. It's the same thing. They won a massive subsidy, and there are 300 people who didn't have their name selected are then out in the marketplace paying full prices, and we have some people who are really benefiting and others are being left out. The approach to looking at the income levels, say for argument's sake, everyone under $100,000 will have a decrease in their taxes payable, would level the playing field across all residents in BC, and especially with tax rates now creeping up to over 50%, housing is not becoming the biggest cost to affordability. Taxes are. You're spending $50,000 a year on taxes, and then you're left $50,000 to cover the rest of your living expenses. If we can bring down the tax rates, especially for the up to $150,000 income households, and let them distribute that money how they want, whether it's housing or experiences or whatever else, it creates more choice in the marketplace.
Well, you take that 30% as what you should be able to afford for housing. It's 30% of your gross, which is, up to now 60% of your net because the government took your first 50%. Mm-hmm. We have very socialized things like that in Canada where people who make more money pay, more taxes, and people who make, we all get an automatic tax deduction at the end of the year for, I know it's a small amount, but, everybody who owns very or earns very little money is going to pay less tax. But yeah, how do you apply that across to housing and everything? I was the chair of the Metro Vancouver Housing Committee and the Metro Vancouver Housing Corporation, and we had an unbelievably good model where all of our developments, we had about 10,000 people in housing in Metro Vancouver, and all of our developments were a mix of market and below market. But every complex, every development, every site had to self-fund. So for everybody who paid $200 a month, we had to have somebody who paid $2,200 a month to get to our costs, which were, say, $1,500 a month. And we could manage it that way, but we did see we were decreasing the number of, really below market rentals, highly subsidized, because our costs were going up. And that's on older existing housing. How could you possibly do that if you had to have land and construction costs today? You could never do it without the highest amount of subsidies. But if you're going to subsidize it, again, having the government involved in that, I have a suggestion for them. Tell them to come and reimburse you for your housing and buy it from you and let them do whatever they want. If they think it's so easy to provide below market housing, have at it. But they're not. So that's why I say, if they're not in the market to tell you as a developer or anybody what they have to do, you don't have the benefits of being a government saying, well, we need more money, let's put our taxes up. You can hopefully stay in business, or at some point you're going to have to shut your business because you have no money left. So if you want the private sector doing social services and effectively welfare for you, and I don't mean welfare in a negative way, welfare being, you're providing financial assistance to people who couldn't otherwise make it in that style of housing, then there has to be some recognition at the government level that, we're paying taxes into the collective and we're sharing it back out to the collective in some sort of equalization. And you can't be expected as a developer or a realtor or anybody like that, a landowner, to just take that on because it's never going to be fair to you or to your buyers or your renters. So I think that's the scariest part of all of it. And that's why my conclusion is if the government isn't in the market, you can try to incentivize, but then you're tiptoeing into the market without, you're putting your toe into that pool without going for a swim. So that when they decide down the road to get out of it again, they've left you high and dry now. And then imagine somebody says, you're not going to be allowed to redevelop that 60-year-old building, which is now end of life, unless you accommodate all of those people at that $300 a month. That's if you take Metro in terms of some of those old contracts that they have, you can't rebuild. People who are providing affordable housing for people who couldn't otherwise afford it, when you start vilifying them and saying you're not doing enough, don't be surprised when they just say, fine, then I'm out. Why do that? I know and that they've criticized developers because they're like, oh, well, your build cost on that was only $800 a square foot and you sold it for $1,000 a square foot. It's like, okay, so that's 20%. It took me 11 years to get that project built. So that's under 2% a year. I could just put my money into a GIC and get 2% a year. So at some point you push people out of the market by bullying them into saying, I know in Port Moody, these conversations, well, we want 25% of that housing to be below market. It's like, now you're changing what the market is. If you want to keep market where it was, then 25% have to be paying well above market. Who's going to go pay above market for anything? You can't, it's not that simple. And there has to be a way of figuring out how that works. But governments are, in my mind, responsible for that. Taking care of social welfare, keep making sure that the population is taken care of, falls to the government. It doesn't fall to your neighbors or your developers. So
Why do we not have any discussion around high speed rail?
our MLA was the secretary for transportation, going to do the high speed rail corridor to the states. I've been in
Why
transportation.
go to the states?
I don't know because we have the Amtrak there now. I guess it was just a natural. They have the Cascadia initiative, which Cascadia being the whole Cascades thing into Washington and Oregon and even California. And I think there's thought that there's a lot of trade there. I don't think there's as much trade there as they're saying, but the fact that we don't have the old rail line that at least ran out to the valley, where the freeway is now, was all pulled up, and they had that in the 30s and 40s. We don't have it now. If we could get to Calgary quickly, I know there's terrain issues and this is a tough country again because of the topography, but at some point, these are things that aren't getting discussed at all. And if there's a will, there's a way, and if there's a collective push to do it, and then you open up things like opening up where land is very cheap and populations are very low, and you can build a whole city. You could go, and you look at some places where they've followed resources like Fort St. John and Fort Mac and those places where they've built cities around an industry. Well, maybe that industry is just data centers or whatever, and you can build high-speed connections to connect these places together without those transportation costs. I don't know how airlines do $49 flights, but they all go bankrupt when they do. But they're trying to make those connections for people. So yeah, I don't know why we don't ever talk about that in a country that's as big as Canada.
We keep working towards reducing the land costs here as the goal for affordability, and whether it's the government owning it or any other entity, seems much easier to take all that money that the developers are investing into subsidized below market housing, plus all the government initiatives to subsidize housing, and pool it into infrastructure and find that solution to get to the land that already has a zero land cost, only 2 to 3 hours drive outside of
Yeah.
Vancouver, which in high speed rail could become a 30-minute commute.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, they've said that, Kamloops or Kelowna could be a 30-minute train trip. And, when you look at it, you're like, okay, well, I can do it in 3 hours in my car. And I'm only averaging for that trip, I'm only averaging like 70 kilometers an hour. So if you had the train we ran in China, which was 425 kilometers an hour, that's almost 5 times faster, right? So you can change those dynamics a lot. And you can really then start looking at big picture things like what does make the most sense for that industry, or that, maybe a big employer steps up and says, we're going to move our worldwide headquarters to Chetwynd, or, sorry, maybe I shouldn't say Chetwynd, but I don't know. You can move to a place where you can completely change the dynamics of what's going on there, and it wouldn't have any real impact at all.
Maybe an improvement. You look at the West Coast Express, where you have comfortable seats, Wi-Fi, washrooms. That seems like a much more
Yeah.
enjoyable way to get to downtown Vancouver than sitting in bumper to bumper traffic.
Yeah, the best 25-minute commute in the world. I loved it when I had to do that when the West Coast Express was there. And then even with the SkyTrain now, it's, you got to get off once or twice depending on which way you go. And it's super busy and crowded and not comfortable. It takes about an hour 10. But then when you listen to the responses from government about that stuff, I get it, it's expensive. So their motivation is, if we make traffic so bad to push you onto SkyTrain, then that's how we're going to grow ridership on transit. It's like, or what if it was a good experience and it was done for positive reasons? The kids and stuff that I know that don't own cars and that use transit, they've grown up that way. They're at a point now where they drive sometimes, they use Uber, they use some transit, they're somewhere in between. So now you've got to wait till the next generation before self-driving cars and transit are really what they're using. So that's 45 years now. So I'm long gone. It's not my problem, but maybe that's part of the problem. In municipal government, people think in terms of what can they do in 4 years. And in provincial, politics, it's like, what's going to happen on my term? So getting them to think, what if we started today? And it wasn't something that wasn't going to be finished for maybe 25 or 30 years, but let's start it. Let's plan for it. Let's put those rail right of ways aside. Yeah, I think long-term planning is a flaw of government, every level of government, because there's nothing in it for the individuals to look beyond the end of their mandate. So if you've got a prime minister, a premier, a mayor, a councillor, everybody's like, what can we do in my term? And that makes decision making way too small focused, and they need to be able to open that up.
So bringing this back to the beginning of the conversation, one of the three housing bills was for the mandate of 4 to 6 unit townhomes on single family properties. Was there any other choice for the NDP to make the change? Because if they left any ounce of discretion from the city's level, would it ever have got approved?
Well, one of the later things we did in my term in Port Moody was that we did small lot subdivisions. So we allowed people to cut their lot in half. And then we also changed how many units they were allowed to have on each one. So you could have a house with a basement suite and a laneway house. So that's 3 on a half lot from what we had before, which was 1.5 on a half lot. So, or on a full lot. So we had gone up 6 times the density with that. And that's powerful, right? It's slow change, I know, but it takes in areas like Moody Center and moves them forward, and maybe baby steps forward, but it does move them forward.
So this is where, and we worked with you on this policy and we were excited about it. It took many of us 4 to 5 years from the start of the application to getting those homes built, and leaving that much discretion for public hearings and staff feedback and back and forth from what the community wants. The pre-zoning and the mandate to take out the politicization of building this housing has shown to be extremely beneficial in Vancouver in their multiplex zone, and in Burnaby, where they've not even required a development permit. You go into the building permit department like you're building a single family house with 4 to 6 townhouse units.
Again, there's some reality in a lot of neighborhoods or a lot of cities where that's just like, let's get real. You're not going to go around Metrotown and say, I want to keep those single family homes. It's just impractical, and it's not good. And I know because of some developments that you had some involvement in Coquitlam, where they wanted to go from single family to low density townhomes, where the neighbors rose up at public hearings, over my dead body. It's just ridiculous. But in my mind, and I'm a former local government person, so if you don't leave the local governments to do planning for the cities, then what value do they have at all? If you're concerned about the time it takes to get those things done, then fix the processes. You don't need to completely change everything. So does the province need to come in and force municipalities to do it? I think there's a really big conversation there about what a municipality is. First of all, they're not a level of government. They're a corporation that's identified and created by the province. We have elections, but it's really, the province can always override municipalities. They work under the Local Government Act and the Community Charter, which are provincial documents. So it is really a corporation, and they can't really do a lot about it if they don't like it at the cities, because the province can just say, no, it's not your mandate anymore. Is it heavy-handed? Yes. But I would rather see more meaningful change. I think the big problem in Metro Vancouver is it's been too slow up to now, so it has to go very quickly from here forward to catch up. And everybody's going to feel that pain.
Let me put something else to you, and I just thought of this while we're talking. Is one of the challenges that I've seen is that the mayor and council tables on the municipal level have a wide variety of voices, minimal consensus, and really how are they set up to succeed whenever you put 8 people with differing views or 7 people with differing views that have to be reelected every 4 years and come from different backgrounds and require some level of education on what it means to be a counselor for the first year of their term. Is the system set up for success, or would we be better off taking 7 counselors and making 1 mayor and 2 counselors and a much more nimble group of 3 to hear the public concerns and hopefully reduce some of the delays in making decisions?
I don't think it would help. In provincially and federally, we have basically two-party systems, right? You've got the opposition and you've got the government. Once in a while, you get a minority where you've got a split. But, they still just tee off on each other and yell and scream at each other. And you're wrong, I'm wrong, everybody's wrong. And municipalities, I did 4 terms on council and really was, up until the last one, it wasn't nearly as caustic as it is now. And my fear on leaving was that a lot of future elections were going to be about voting people out, and it was going to be about being very negative and creating animosity because people were seeing that as a way to get elected. It's easier to run against things than it is to just stand up and say, here's what I think is good for us. So I think it's a slippery slope. But I think if you have good rules and policy and you have good employees at the staff level, if the councils are governance bodies focusing on governance and community versus planning and building and managing, I think you'd get a lot better outcomes. So if the government policies, again, a local government is fully regulated by the Community Charter and the Local Government Act. So make sure those things are defined well enough that everybody stays in their lane. Every city council I've seen, to one degree, wants to put their name on a plaque. They want to cut a ribbon. They want to do something in their term that they can stand up and pound their chest so that in the next term they can say, look what I've done for you. And it's great that you're doing things for people, but people tend to gravitate towards the lower hanging fruit, and change is always difficult. We're at an unprecedented time of change because of the growth and some of the relapses from the 1980s up until now where we weren't planning ahead. And it's going to be difficult for everybody. Moody Center is a defined neighborhood, but some of it should be redefined because the streets were defined when people had no cars, or they were gravel roads. Everything has changed. So you can't just keep saying, well, here's the grid we have to work in. At some point, somebody needs to say, let's change the grid. And I know planners and transportation engineers would jump up right away and say, yeah, let's do it. And councilors and mayors and the neighbors would say, no, no way. So you've got to break that down. And I think if on policy levels, if the provincial government could say and have rules that says to council, no, that ain't up to you. When CACs came along, people were just making random decisions. You want a 20-story building, we want $180,000 to put in a new playground with a spray park in it. There's no rule about it. There was no formula for it. They were just randomly asking for things, which were really knee-jerk, short-term things that were going to help those people in the next election say, I'm the one who brought you that spray park where your kids play. Not the guy that 20 years from now you're going, why didn't someone build a road here? Why isn't there an overpass? I don't know how Port Coquitlam built a $200 million overpass over the railroad tracks out there, but what a great project for the city of Port Coquitlam. You don't have to drive all the way around all those tracks. And imagine if you had to today go over to Kingsway or over to Westwood and go around everything. They took a big financial investment there in the future of Port Coquitlam. There's a lot of cities that have grown with small thinking on big projects. We want to grow and we want to be a great metropolis in the world, but we still want to have all those things that we had in 1941. And at some point you have to say, let's rethink. And we hire those people to work for the cities that would love that. They would love to sit down with a great developer, a great planner, and a great council who says, yeah, sounds great, guys. You guys know what you're doing. I got elected because I put this pretty mug on a sign and I got people to vote for me in a popularity contest. But those people are hired for the skills and the ability and the knowledge that they have. So let them use it. So the province says, we're going to take this away and we're going to bring it in-house. Well, I don't think they have any better people in their bureaucracy than we have in ours. And they probably do a lot more meddling provincially in what the staff are given as their mandate, because they have majority governments where nobody can stop them. As much as we hate it when councils get dysfunctional, at least it's an indication that there are some other voices in play, and it's not just, this council that can do whatever they want now and nobody can stop them. Politics is unwinnable at times.
We are obviously big supporters of that small scale multi-unit housing, but even as strong as the NDP was, there's only 2 cities that have viable zoning bylaws. Vancouver, who produced their zoning bylaw before the provincial announcements, and Burnaby. And Burnaby was well in the process of defining their own zoning bylaw before the provincial announcements. Every other Metro Vancouver city could not get the zoning bylaw to be viable by either restricting the FSR to such an extent that you can only build 800 square foot condos for 800 square foot condos, or a development permit process that is so undefined and uncertain that is not reliable, or essentially copped out by saying you can only have a rental building, which is White Rock, or at most a duplex with rental suites, New Westminster, Port Coquitlam, the North Shore, which again has no viability to it and will lead to no more increased housing.
I think in New West and North Van, probably district, I guess, are the ones that worry me the most, because they, in the past, they were leading edge. They had a lot of rentals. They had, North Van did non-asymmetrical duplexes. So they let everybody do duplexes, but not those things where it just looks like 2 houses attached to each other. And so in some ways, they're moving backwards on their policy if they're going to start discouraging that stuff. But there's, Burnaby and Vancouver, is it a coincidence that they both have a ton of land holdings? They were both out there being brave enough to go buy land. Their policy was go buy land when the market's down, and then lead rezoning and redevelopment and rejuvenation of these neighborhoods. The city would make the money. They both have multi-billion-dollar land corporations that are part, and they manage rentals, they manage properties. They're the 2, obviously they were traditionally the 2 biggest cities in Metro Vancouver, but they also, go back to Bill Copeland and probably Gordon Campbell in Vancouver, where they had that vision to look way beyond their mandate and say, hey, here's what we're going to do. But I think systemically, somebody needs to step back and say, let's change the way we operate. There's always room for private business to support government initiatives and policy. Again, government doesn't need to build a home. We don't want, NDP construction crews out there building high rises. We want the private sector to power the economy that way. But it's the policy and the governance of that stuff that they need to concentrate on, because that should be relatively easy. If you listen to the private sector, the builders, the developers, the planners, and they're giving your input, just believe them. Just take them for what they're worth. I don't think we have anybody in the provincial government right now that came from social housing financing backgrounds or even strong policies. But even in this NDP government, in 7 years, this wasn't their big agenda item in 2016, 2017 when they ran. This has happened in the last 5-6 years where it's gotten critical. So good for them, I guess, for being able to pivot on a lot of it, and hopefully it continues.
Thank you for being here.
Hey, love it.
Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thanks for tuning in to another insightful episode of the Laidler Academy podcast. We hope you find today's discussion informative and inspiring. Here at Laidler Academy, we're committed to helping you unlock your potential and transform your life, providing the insights you need to succeed in real estate. If you have any specific topics or questions you'd like us to cover in future episodes, feel free to reach out to us through social media or email info@laidleracademy.com. Thanks again, and see you on the next episode of the Laidler Academy podcast.